I'm going to start just by reading Colossians 1, 15 to 23. He, Christ, is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For in him all things in heaven and on earth were created, things visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or powers. All things have been created through him and for him. He himself is before all things, and in him all things hold together. He is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, so that he might come to have first place in everything. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him God was pleased to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, by making peace through the blood of his cross. And you, who were once estranged and hostile in mind, doing evil deeds, he is now reconciled in his fleshly body through death, so as to present you holy and blameless and irreproachable before him, provided that you continue securely established and steadfast in the faith, without shifting from the hope promised by the gospel that you heard, which has been proclaimed to every creature under heaven. I, Paul, became a servant of the gospel. We almost always start our thinking about what it is to be a Christian with the wrong question. And that is something that I've realised more and more closely. I know this is going to sound incredibly basic and simple, so forgive me for that, but I'm a slow learner, and it took me a long time to really pick this up. That most often, particularly on the ecumenical side, we start our questions with what do I believe? And what do they believe? And what do we all believe? But the question is, if you read John's Gospel, particularly John 16, John 14, the question we should be asking before we ask what we believe is, who do we follow? The who comes before the what. When we start with the what, we end up in all kinds of trouble. When we start with the who, we end up in all kinds of unity. There are many passages in the Bible which refer to reconciliation, as Sam Wells, the vicar of St Martin's in the Fields, and one of our in the Church of England, one of our best priest theologians, said at the beginning of a talk about eight years ago, reconciliation is the gospel. However, I want to focus on this passage from Colossians 1 at the beginning of this talk on reconciliation. Because within this passage there are three unities. And those three unities are all based around Christ, who, and in being based around who Christ is, call us to unity and reconciliation through Christ, who we follow, within the church and as individuals. The first of those unities is in verses 15 to 17. Here Christ is presented as the image of the invisible God. And in verse 16, in him all things in heaven and on earth were created. Within Islamic theology, the reason for the immense focus on one God is because there is one God who made one creation. It is something that we too often forget. God, who is perfectly one, has made a universe that is perfectly one. The very nature of God, as seen in God's creation, is of diversity and unity held perfectly together. The very nature of creation springs from the unity and diversity of the Trinity. They teach us that God is one, and they teach us that creation is one. The richness of its creation and its variety is yet all one, interdependent and whole. That's why we have a crisis with biodiversity, because if you start knocking out 20,000 species a year, even ones that we've never heard of, they are there for a purpose. And when we start knocking them out, then the creation is diminished. That's why it matters so much. And the unity of creation is the fundamental basis of our call for reconciliation, for the second greatest reconciliation of all, the first being with God in Jesus Christ, and the second being with the creation that God has given us. We are at war with creation. It's an undeclared war. It's asymmetric warfare. Until quite recently, that is warfare in which one side is bigger and more powerful than the other. Creation is bigger and more powerful than humanity. But our continual terrorist attacks on creation over the last couple of hundred years since the Industrial Revolution are greater and greater terrorist attacks at the moment, means that we are at war with creation, and there needs to be reconciliation. That's why climate change matters so much, as well as biodiversity. Second, verses 18 to 20, the second and key part of God's creation is the creation of the church, of God's church. Note, he doesn't say churches. He says church. Tom Wright, when asked what would surprise Paul most if he got into a time machine and came to see what was going on today, said, "Oh, that's simple." The person who'd asked him was expecting him to say the church's attitude to sexuality, by the way. And Tom Wright said, the number of churches, the divisions in the church. So the church has Christ as its single head, the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, so that he might come to have first place in everything. The church must find its way to visible unity, maintaining profound diversity, because Christ is the head. We often confuse this in practice, though holding to it in theory. So in the Anglican Communion, the Archbishop is often referred to as the first among equals. But in fact, the Archbishop of Canterbury is simply one of the many who belong to the first, who serve the first, who follow the first, which is Christ. Who is Christ? The third unity is of our unity with Christ through his death on the cross. It is this unity that calls us to be missionary and evangelistic, because the gospel, verse 23, has been proclaimed to every creature under heaven. If we belong to Christ, we will be part of the universal proclamation of the gospel to human beings, and as St. Francis, to creation, in our love for creation in a way that by our acts and deeds we show we love the creation that God has given us. In these few and extraordinary verses, the whole call of the Christian is presented. It is a call to unity, to transformation, to internal finding of peace. In other words, to reconciliation. So let us look secondly, having looked at the theology and a piece of Scripture, let us look secondly at the context of the mission, the Missio Dei, the mission of God, which we are called to live. And the context is not entirely good, as you know, as we all know. To put it in summary form, the four horsemen of the apocalypse are indulging in significant amounts of overtime, to the degree that I'm sure they are breaking the European Working Time Directive. But I suspect they're English and therefore anti-European anyway. Better take that out of the record. I'll be in trouble. First, the context is of war and the threat of wider wars. In the considerable and absolutely rightful horror of what is happening in Ukraine, we have forgotten the issues of the other 49 conflicts around the world which are recognised by the United Nations. They include Myanmar, which is now in full-scale civil war. I was talking to our Archbishop there a couple of weeks ago. And significant other levels of fighting continuing in Syria, Iraq, together with threats of war elsewhere in the Middle East. And in addition, there are continual wars across the great crescent of Africa, which spreads from Somalia in the east to Nigeria in the west through the Sahel. And then the context is also of an extraordinarily rapid change in science and technology. It's a morally neutral issue, but which threatens and promises in equal measure. It is widely recognised by scientists and those dealing in the most important developments of technology and robotics and other areas like that, artificial intelligence, that the next 40 years, which looking around most of us won't see, but a few will. Sorry to be rude, but let's just face facts, shall we? I mean, you'll be all right. There must be others. I'll have been pushing up the daisies for a while. But in the next 40 years, we will see the fastest change in science and technology in all of human history. Which means our children, and for some of us our grandchildren, will by the time they're my age, 66, be living in a world that is unrecognisable. And this change threatens the increases of justice and inequality and promises or offers the opportunity for fairness and hope to the poorest in the world. It holds in its hand new weapons that can kill more people, robots that can fight on the battlefield and be programmed to anything except compassion. And it may give to the rich and powerful strength which is orders of magnitude greater than their enemies. In the 1890s at the Battle of Omdurman, the British lost 200 casualties out of 20,000, I think, that were fighting, or something like that, fighting 120,000 of the Mahdi's army, who lost tens of thousands because we had Gatling guns and repeating rifles. That will be as nothing to future wars, all the ones we're seeing today. And so this change equally holds the thought of machinery that can increase the provision of crops, of scientific advances that will multiply the capacity of different forms of foodstuffs, both to feed and to survive in hotter atmospheres. I was at Kew in December and talking to one of the curators there, or whatever they call themselves, scientists anyway, and they have developed a coffee plant that can cope with 4 degrees higher temperatures than existing coffee plants, which means coffee production can survive in West Africa, and West Africa can continue to export coffee and therefore can continue to earn money from exporting coffee. Same goes for Brazil and other places. And thirdly, most devastatingly and overarching all other threats, is the issue of climate change. We need to recognise that the major impact of climate change will not only be felt on the natural world and the collapse of biodiversity, but that it will lead to serious problems of hunger already appearing in sub-Saharan Africa, and thus of population movement around the world, also because of sea level rises in places like Bengal, Bangladesh, and others. Population movement always causes war, which in turn prevents people focusing on climate change, which in turn causes faster rises in temperature, and so you can see the way that it threatens to go. Already we are recognising that some of the steps towards decarbonisation of the climate are threatened by the war in Ukraine and Russia, and by the consequent need to have energy security and independence that does not depend on Russian gas, but may depend on things like fracking in this country, when the choice is between heat and eat. We have to have, in this country, energy that is affordable by the poorest, or they will die of hypothermia. We have to have food. And so this has to be a focus. But how are we going to square that circle when we're not talking 10 years down the line, we're talking next winter? The final and very short-term threat, already existing, and which will become a major issue of the next few years, is the entire dysfunction of the Western economy. I'm trying to cheer you up this evening. Rowan Williams, in one of his most profound philosophical statements, once said to me before I was doing this job, he said to me, there is almost no situation on earth that cannot be resolved with the hermeneutical tool of Winnie the Pooh. That's Rowan at his best. And the reality is that I'm Eeyore, not Tigger. Most of you are probably Tigger. From the crash in 2008-9, the European sovereign debt crisis in the early teens, the impact of COVID, and now the extraordinarily rapid rise of inflation, the collapse of logistics and supply chains, and the consequent most rapid fall in real incomes of the poorest in this country since records began in 1951, the impact of this hidden nuclear explosion in the economy will be fallout that causes chaos and misery right around the world, but also here, with those who can suffer it least. What will be the outcomes? They may well be recession or even depression. There will certainly be governments prone towards rearmament to protect ourselves against further Russian expansionism as the war in Ukraine drags on, or perhaps becomes chronic rather than critical, and to raise the hurdle of the use of nuclear weapons from its present too low height. Nuclear weapons are used when conventional weaponry ceases to be effective to defend your country. If you don't have much conventional weaponry, and we've got the smallest army now since 1823, you find yourself forced into the use of nuclear weapons earlier than you would have been otherwise, if the war continues, which it may not. Ironically, the answer to avoiding nuclear exchange is effective conventional weaponry. There is an alternative, which is the universal conversion of everyone and the end of sin, which I'd prefer, but I have to say I'm not entirely convinced by, looking at myself and my others. So what do we do with this context and with this theology? First, I want to suggest that the diversity of creation and the unity and diversity of the Trinity, anchored in mutual love perfected, calls us to learn that we should not all be identical, but that where we are different, that difference must be held in love within the church. And because we're human and sinful, where we disagree, we must learn to disagree well. That doesn't mean indifference to disagreement. It doesn't mean shrugging our shoulders. It means actually having the difficult conversations. That's not very easy in the ecumenical, or for that matter, the interfaith world. We do tea and cake meetings. We meet, we have tea, we have cake, we comment to each other that the tea and cake are superb. And then we issue a press statement saying we agreed on everything we talked about. But an ecumenism that involves disagreeing well also means reshaping ourselves, CTE and CTBI and all the rest, to look outwards and respond to the crises that surround us with the love of God that is within us and with the unity that can be reached at any moment between us. It calls us away from looking inward, away from creating a zero-sum church in which one group's gain is another's loss. Second, so my first aim is look outwards. Ask the who question. Who is it we follow? And where do we find the Spirit of God at work? Look outwards, because the Spirit is at work even where we aren't. Second, in addition to our aim, I want to suggest an approach. The approach must be holistic, contextual, top-down, middle-out and bottom-up. And finally, just to cheer you up again, sacrificial. I was almost getting cheerful for a moment. Holistic. We too often behave, both in dealing with the conflicts between human beings within the world and in the conflicts within the church, as if we were minds and souls detached from the body. As is quite well known, I have periods of depression. When I am depressed, I become frustrated, less capable of dealing with anxiety, and I'm more likely to be bad-tempered. Those characteristics come from chemical changes within me. That's not an excuse. There is no excuse for bad behaviour, but it is a reason. When I forget the body, I ignore one of the key means of dealing with conflicts in which I participate, to which I am subject or which I initiate. The same applies to groups. Operating in a group, fears of other people's powers has been shown to lead to chemical changes in the way the brain reacts. Neuroscience matters. Don't forget the body. A holistic approach to our societal, to our internal politics and polity within our churches, a recognition of when we feel threatened and of the impact of that will change the way we relate to each other. We have to be holistic and deal with the whole human being, body, mind, and spirit. Contextual. The context of our conflicts is one of immense importance. Within the church, the context is, in this country, remains of a moderately comfortable Christianity. That means that unity has, for many, many centuries, been a luxury rather than a necessity, and that has lasted the thick end of half a millennium. We feel it acceptable not only to be different, but to other and to demonize different groups. In the world, in Europe, the context until the last few weeks has been one without major land wars between nation states since 1945. We are shocked because we have never experienced what we now see. My father-in-law, who landed on D-Day and fought all but 3 days until VE Day, would have been horrified but not shocked because he'd seen it all before. But that generation's gone. Context is why this crisis offers us so much danger of drifting towards all-out war. People say we must have a no-fly zone. That means declaring war on a nuclear-armed power. Well, that's, in most contexts, a relatively serious decision to take. The church is called, in facing the world, to be prophetic about the call of peace, the claims of forgiveness, and the hope of reconciliation. Top down, middle out, bottom up. Reconciliation never succeeds until it comes at all levels of an institution, of an organisation, or of a conflict. I remember working on reconciliation in a local area in Nigeria. Unusually for me, we were very successful. For a few years, there was peace, until, at a much higher level than we'd been working at, a breakdown in relationships led to the weaponization of the grassroots against each other. We had not done the top down. Equally, after the Oslo Accords in the Middle East in the 90s, which ignored completely issues of religion, the bottom up was omitted. And it was the breakdown there and in the middle out, amongst the day-to-day work of leadership at the local level, that meant that the Oslo Accords themselves failed. And sacrificial. The passage from Colossians 1 ends with the mention of the cross. Reconciliation is deeply sacrificial. Jesus calls us to go, to live, to die, to be raised to new life with him, and to be at his side. We cannot avoid any of those, including dying, if necessary, in the service of the reconciliation of all things with God. So what action do we take? Well, I will make a few, and don't worry, I'm on my last page, but 38. The practice of division leads to the habit of division. They becomes how we describe other Christians. Theologically, we have to begin our reconciliation, to come constantly back to the reality of what we see here in Colossians 1, what we see in John's Gospel, especially chapter 17, verse 21 to 26, and the singleness of God whom we worship, Trinity and diversity held singly in perfect love. Perfect, literally. Second, reconciliation has to be deliberate. It is not like catching a disease where it happens unconsciously. It doesn't simply happen. We heard earlier a reading at the beginning of our session from 2 Corinthians, calling us to be ambassadors of reconciliation. We see that the call to reconciliation is a call to a deliberate acceptance of reconciliation with God, who, not what, not a reconciliation first of doctrine, but a reconciliation first with the who, from whom the doctrine flows, so that with God we may be one. Accessibility. We reconcile with people, not to people. We serve people, we do not direct people. We demonstrate that we put ourselves alongside them, not above them or outside them, observing patronizingly from a distance. Partnered and holistic. None of us are capable of bringing reconciliation through our own selves entirely. The single hero who goes out and makes peace is a myth. They're always backed by enormous teams. Things like the Nobel Prize are great and wonderful, but they disguise the reality of the vast amounts of work that were necessary to make peace. One only has to look at Ukraine to see that there will be a need for reconciliation of mind, body, spirit and politics. And you can't leave any of them out. There will be a need to meet needs through rebuilding and a need to establish security for the future, perhaps by peacekeeping forces. There may be a need for worse, to make peace. We need to know our limits, to share the load with partners, to understand the nature of the body, both Christ's body, the church, and our own bodies individually. And of our actions must be long-term and equipping. The last gift of Jesus, promised in John 16, is the Spirit, the Comforter, the Encourager, who gives and comes from God and is God. John's Gospel promises that the Spirit will go on teaching us. Our role is always, as God does with us, to equip others for reconciliation. Not to create dependence, but sustainability through a direct relationship with God, through it calling people to follow Jesus. Reconciliation is something to be shared, trained in, and given away. At Lambeth Palace, the team who works on this have written something called the Difference Course. It's designed for churches of all sorts and is being rolled out and developed more broadly for secular use and interfaith use. It's a form of training. It teaches 3 habits of being curious about the person with whom you disagree, being present, so you're not actually talking while you continue just to check your emails. I might just answer that one. It's not, and reimagining conflict. The overall aim, to conclude, is very simple. We exist not for ourselves, not for the church to which we belong. We exist to glorify Christ. If we don't do that, we're a waste of space, frankly, and money. And if you're an Anglican, a lot of funny clothes. Yet our divisions do not glorify Christ. The capacity, the willingness and the ability, holistically and in partnership, to work together in a world torn apart by war, whether within the family or between nation states and everything beneath, points to the Prince of Peace. The ability to work together points to the Prince of Peace. And that ability of disagreeing well, of loving one another in diversity, opens hearts, minds, lives, society to grace abundant. Thank you.